In December 2022, I published a video titled Stop Procrastinating with Note-Taking Apps. And I made this video mostly for myself because I kept jumping around from tool to tool, software to software, trying to find that perfect app that would solve all my productivity problems. Now, the video just happened to blow up. At this point, it's got over 450,000 views and something like 1,200 comments from people who were dealing with the exact same issue, this procrastinating by note-taking instead of actually doing the work. And I think this is a much bigger problem than I first thought it was. Personal knowledge management, or the meta idea of like note-taking, has become more of a hobby than anything, even if people won't admit it. If you do a YouTube search for Obsidian or Tana or PKM, what you'll see is an endless list of tutorials that show you how to set up these complex note-taking structures inside the software. And 99% of this, I'm going to say it, is pseudo-productive mental masturbation. It's performative productivity. It's this constant preparation and organization, but zero real work. It's comfortable, it's kind of fun, it's pleasant, but it's also a bit lame. Because at the end of the day, people don't care what your note-taking system looks like. They don't care whether you use Capacities or Obsidian or Apple Notes or pen and paper. The only people who are impressed by your Obsidian graph are other people who are into personal knowledge management. What people ultimately pay attention to and what you should care about is the work you produce with your note-taking system and skills. Now, if you want to treat it as a hobby, fine. All the more power to you. There are worse things that you can spend your time on. But if you want to actually use your notes and your note-taking system to produce better work, to write great essays, to put together a book, to become a better thinker, then your note-taking must support that goal and not detract from it. Unfortunately, I think lots of us are going about it all wrong. And that's what I'm going to talk about in this video. We've got to start by talking about the over-selection problem, why we take more notes than we should, and how it makes us less productive and creative. Then we'll look at one part of the solution, which is selective consumption and selective capture. That includes how to find great material to consume in the first place, like books, and how to ruthlessly select the best ideas and concepts from the material that you consume. We're going to talk about why writing and output, creative output, is crucial. And finally, what this can look like for you if you put it all together and you do it right. How good note-taking and output compounds and multiplies your productivity and your creativity. So let's dive in, starting with the over-selection problem. Something I mentioned in the rise of dopamine culture is that technology shapes us just as much as we shape it. We build tools like digital note-taking apps, and they shape our behavior in ways that we don't quite expect or predict. See, the implicit promise of digital note-taking apps is that they are far more useful than analog note-taking, than writing on a notebook like this or using some sort of physical note-taking system. After all, typing beats writing. You can copy and paste, which is obviously better, or so we think, than painstakingly writing things out by hand. You can link your notes together, whether it's bi-directional or hyperlinks. You can save pages using a web clipper. You can automatically sync from Kindle. It's portable and it works across all your devices. And if your house burns down in a fire, it's all good because it's in the cloud. You'll be fine. Ignoring these benefits is naive. Digital note-taking is useful in many ways, no question. But it's also naive to ignore the downstream negative effects of this innovation, such as the over-selection problem. Digital note-taking apps, in a way, subconsciously demand to be used. Think about it. What's the first thing you do when you download a new note-taking app? You want to add stuff to it. You want to fill it with notes. It doesn't necessarily matter what those notes are. You just want to put things in the system so you can see everything fit together. You want to see that graph view expand. You want to see the bi-directional links increase. The second brain must grow. This subconscious demand, combined with a lack of friction that digital note-taking apps offer, it's not hard to just copy and paste or type something in or automatically import Kindle highlights, it leads to indiscriminate note-taking. We figure that we might as well capture something, even if it's mediocre, and add zero value because it doesn't cost us anything other than a few clicks. And who knows, we might use it in the future. And so we end up with a library of information, mostly noise and little signal. We capture and organize masses of information without deepening our understanding. We maximize input, particularly quantity, without it leading to creative output. But I don't think this is the real problem with overselection. After all, what's the big deal with having a bunch of notes in your app, in your library that you don't need? They'll just sit there and you'll never see them again. And if you do need them in the future, they'll be there. Better to have them than to not have them, right? Well, I think the real problem isn't that you build a library of noise, though that is a problem. It's that indiscriminate note-taking, capturing without selection, capturing without filtering, makes you less intelligent, less creative, and less productive. And that's because being able to filter and select information is a skill. The same way a good writer will ruthlessly edit their work and remove anything that doesn't add value, a good note-taker has a high standard for what enters their second mind or their second brain. The better your inputs, the better your outputs. When you overselect or you don't select at all, you just add, you don't develop any judgment. You don't leverage your unique taste. You end up being an information hoarder as opposed to an information synthesizer. Information hoarders obsessively collect whatever captures their attention. Synthesizers select the truly compelling and useful. Hoarders, without ever admitting it, act on the belief that the more information, the better. Synthesizers believe that the more understanding, the better. Hoarders capture information for just-in-case scenarios. They have a fear of forgetting things, even if it's mediocre things and ideas. Synthesizers trust their own intuitive filtering ability, and they let mediocre and even good ideas and information pass them by so that they can maintain a high signal and useful second mind. Hoarders take notes without any goal or project in the works. Synthesizers take notes for future projects, for present projects, and simply because they're curious, but they are always working on something that inspires them, inspires their consumption and their note-taking. Finally, hoarders take notes for the sake of taking notes. Synthesizers take notes to produce good work. You do not want to be the hoarder who overselects. You want to be the synthesizer who treats selection and capture as a skill. So how do you do that? Let's have a look. Fundamentally, you want to select less, but better. If you want to increase your understanding and knowledge, you want to do better creative work, then you need to get better at the skill of selection, specifically selective consumption and capture. The better you are at this skill, at this ability, the easier everything else becomes. Now, there's two layers to this, as I mentioned. There's selective consumption, and then there's selective capture. So you must be selective, first of all, in what you consume, what you read, what you watch, what you listen to, and also in what you capture and highlight and reformulate from your consumption of those materials. These work in unison. If you're selective on the capturing layer, but you have poor input material, then you're kind of bottlenecked by that. And it's unlikely that you'll select great ideas when you're not consuming great material, right? If you're selective on the consumption layer, but you over-select when capturing, then you'll just end up with a large quantity of ideas, some great, some good, some mediocre, but you're not developing that skill of filtering, and you end up with a lot of noise. So let's start with selective consumption. It's a great quote that I'm sure you've heard. If you only read the books that everyone else is reading, you can only think what everyone else is thinking. If all you read is New York Times bestsellers, or all you listen to is generic self-help podcasts, then don't expect to come up with unique creative insights. If you want to be good at creative synthesis and be somewhat original in your thinking, then you must avoid only consuming highly synthesized content like New York Times bestsellers, or at least treat it as like junk food consumption, where you have it every once in a while because it's enjoyable, but you know it's not really that good for you. What you want to do is develop your own selection criteria, because I don't know what your goal is. I don't know what kind of work you do, and so you should tailor this for yourself. Your selection criteria is more intuitive than systematic. I don't pick up a book and then run it through a checklist to decide whether I'm going to read it or not. But there are some principles I'm about to share with you that I generally abide by, and feel free to copy them and modify them for yourself. First principle is to prioritize density and active engagement, which will explain why I prefer books to podcasts. Not all media is the same. Books are more information dense than podcasts. An hour of reading is completely different to an hour of listening to two people talk in casual conversation. That's not to say that the latter isn't valuable, but it is, in my opinion, less valuable, especially for the purposes of deepening understanding and doing creative work. When you read something, you're actively engaging with the material in a way that you don't with a passive form of consumption, like podcasts or watching a video. You can reread sentences that don't quite make sense to you straight away. You can spend 10 minutes on one page really trying to understand what it's saying. You pause, you look out the window and think about something that you've just read. It's active, right? And it doesn't happen the same way with podcasts. Like, you don't tend to just pause it and stop and think. Second principle is to avoid the generic and popular unless it's for good reason. Some books are popular because they're actually good. Like Atomic Habits, I think, is a great book. I know people like to rip on it and say that it's too mainstream and it's too simple, but I think it's actually a good book. But a lot of modern mainstream books are low density in their ideas, and they're written to either make money or build authority rather than be written for their own sake. They take a big idea, they repeat it again and again with different stories. And I understand why they do this. I think there's some value in it, but I just think there are simply better things out there to read for the most part. The third principle is to read at least some difficult books. The more actively you're engaged, and this kind of links back to the first principle on active engagement, the more actively you're engaged, the more likely you are to find insights and creative ideas from the material you're consuming. Books and material that's dumbed down and extremely easy to read, paradoxically, can cause you to pay less attention to them. This is something that Nassim Taleb talks about in Anti-Fragile, that there's this overcompensation mechanism that you have when engaging in something difficult or when you're slightly distracted. He mentions that when he's trying to write in a cafe with background noise, he actually focuses more because he has to, try a little bit harder to block that out, which paradoxically, it doesn't sound like it should, but it leads to higher focus. He writes, mental effort moves us into higher gear, activating more vigorous and more analytical brain machinery. Consider how you act when you're reading a book and you come across a difficult page or paragraph. What do? You hone in, you focus, you engage, you block the background noise, you start to strain mentally because you're thinking. And that doesn't happen the same way with easy books. It's so easy to just get distracted and your mind wanders elsewhere and so on and so forth. So I think difficult books, not only do they provide you with good ideas, but you tend to get good ideas out of them because of how focused you need to be to understand what's going on. Fourth principle is to read older books. One benefit to reading older books, particularly non-fiction books, is that you automatically synthesize mentally as you're reading them. You think about how their ideas might fit into the modern day. You develop mental models around how the world has changed and what might happen in the future. For example, one book I much enjoyed reading during my research for The Rise of Dopamine Culture was Lewis Mumford's Techniques and Civilization, published in 1934, so 90 years ago. There were multiple concepts and ideas that I got from that book that I felt were relevant to our current age, especially with the development of AI and its effects on culture. And reading that book for me sparked at least 5 solid essay ideas, which I'm going to work on. And these are ideas that I don't think I would have come across otherwise were I to read like a mainstream book on a similar topic. Final principle is strategic abandonment. I probably finish less than 20% of the books that I start reading. Sometimes the book sucks and I stop reading it. Sometimes it's filled with information and ideas that I already deeply understand and I'm scanning through it to find a specific insight. Sometimes I'm just looking to read 1 or 2 chapters. I think if you're trying to develop the habit of reading, then there's value to pushing through a book all the way to the end. I also think there's value in pushing through difficult books, even when you feel like quitting. But from a selection point of view, strategic abandonment is one of the best tools you have. Your time is limited. Consumption is a game of trade-offs. Every hour that you read one book is an hour that you can't read another, or it's an hour that you're not spending writing or producing some sort of work. And so you should have a strong radar for mediocre material so that you can avoid it or quit reading it as you realize that it's not worth your time. Let's talk about selective capture, that second layer. Selective capture, reformulation, and the importance of friction. So our goal is to move from no or little understanding to more understanding, hopefully sparking new ideas and creativity along the way. We do this through selective consumption, the material that we consume at the top of the funnel, but also selective capture. This means, as I mentioned before, that you raise the bar for what it is that you capture. You don't just highlight any sentence that you think is cool. You highlight that which you cannot avoid highlighting because it's so damn good, it's so compelling, or it's so relevant to the projects you're working on. But if you really want to deepen understanding, then you must write and reformulate ideas in your own words. Zonke Ahrens talks about this in How to Take Smart Notes. He says, if you want to really understand something, you have to translate it into your own words. That's not to say you shouldn't copy excerpts or highlights from books, like direct quotes. Sometimes it's just so damn well written that you can't reformulate it well, or it just feels wrong to do so, or you want to include it in your final work, like a quote in your essay. The point is, if you want to really understand ideas and concepts, then you should reformulate them in your own words, because there's nothing generative or creative about copying and pasting or highlighting. And this will make more sense when we look at the next section on writing to learn. But there's another benefit to this reformulation, which is that it adds friction to your note-taking process. Friction is actually good. Friction is what we want. As I mentioned at the beginning of this piece, digital note-taking removes friction, and that leads to over-selection. But when you add friction into the process, you automatically capture less. You raise your standard and your bar naturally, because you're not going to take notes. You're not going to reformulate on like a piece of paper or an index card. You're not going to reformulate something that doesn't demand to be reformulated. If it's just a mediocre idea, you're not going to put the effort in to write it out by hand or type it out by hand. This is another topic, but it's also why I use a hybrid note-taking system. I do a lot of my note-taking on these cards instead of using a digital note-taking app. And it's because of what I just said. It's because that it adds friction to the process, and it forces me to reformulate and be succinct and only capture the best stuff. And if you haven't done this, then you'll be shocked at how much it changes your ability to understand things. I've read a lot of books in my short life. A lot of them have just gone in and out. And that includes the books that I've made many, many highlights in. Right? But when I added this friction into the process, take a book like Techniques in Civilization, I made 60 highlights roughly throughout the book, the physical book, not the Kindle. And when it came to transferring those highlights to digital and physical notes, I copied about 10 of them word for word by hand, and I reformulated 5. And so from a book of 400 or so pages, I got a good 15 notes. The other 45 highlights that I took, they seemed relevant at the time when I was reading, but they didn't make the cut. After revisiting a week after finishing the book, they weren't compelling enough. But if I didn't have this friction or didn't have this process in place, I would have just, copied those 60 highlights into Obsidian or whatever, and they would have just sat there, and I wouldn't have developed any more understanding. So all this to say, don't view friction as a bad thing. Force yourself to reformulate and view inefficiency as a useful tool. All right, let's talk about writing and output. William Zinsser has a great book called Writing to Learn. There's a quote from that book. He says, "Writing is thinking on paper. Anyone who thinks clearly should be able to write clearly about any subject at all." If you really want to understand something, then you should write about it. Write an essay or a video script or something. Even if you don't publish it, you will understand the topic with a far greater depth than you would otherwise. And this is because writing forces you to think in a structured and clear manner. You think you know something until you try and write about it. And then you come face to face with the gaps in your understanding. You realize that you need to do more research, or you need to go back to the drawing board and think through it all a little bit more. And so you want to have an output, a writing focused approach to note taking. You're not just capturing a bunch of information for the sake of capturing information. You're using it, you're synthesizing it. And by doing so, you get this double reward. You get this deepened understanding that can't be gained without some form of output, some form of creative task like writing. And you get a public piece of work, like an essay or video essay or something, assuming you publish it, that exposes you to all kinds of upside and serendipity. Your library of 1,000 Obsidian notes that don't exist on the internet in a public place, they're not doing anything for you. They're not working to grow your brand or help you connect with people, like-minded people. But when you publish work, when you publish a finished product, that has the potential to do that. You must ask yourself, what is my output? What value am I creating? What am I doing with all this information that I've captured? When will I enter the arena and share my work? Writing and producing work is not easy. Output is harder than input. It's where true friction enters the picture. The pleasant feeling of organizing your notes in your app gives way to the frustration of having to rewrite your shitty first draft of an essay. It's hard, but it's worth it, because it's in this work that you find things that cannot be found through simply reading and capturing information. Some things only come to you through the process of creation and not beforehand. For every essay you write, you might have 3 more essay ideas come to you. It works like that. Creativity begets creativity, and this is why you must be output focused. You must write, you must create. Now, I want to end this video by briefly talking about how selection, how capture, and how output all compound in your favor. See, getting good at these processes, the process of information selection, of reformulation, of thinking, writing, it doesn't just lead to minor gains in your creative output if you do it right. It leads to multiplication. You can actually become 10 times more productive than you would be otherwise. And there are 2 reasons for this. The first is that creativity is non-linear. Ideas are not the same. One essay you write might be 10 times better according to you, just in terms of value, or quantitatively based on the amount of views it gets, than another essay you wrote which you spent even more time on. The better you get at the processes of selection, capture, reformulation, thinking, and writing, the more likely you are to benefit from this non-linearity. And secondly, each individual process multiplies the effectiveness of another. William Shockley, in his 1957 paper, which is called On the Statistics of Individual Variations of Productivity in Research Labs, details this better than I can. He posits this hypothesis for why some scientists are far more prolific than others. Quote, for example, consider the factors that may be involved in publishing a scientific paper. A partial listing, not in order of importance, might be ability to think of a good problem, ability to work on it, ability to recognize a worthwhile result, ability to make a decision as to when to stop and write up the results, ability to write adequately, ability to profit constructively from criticism, determination to submit the paper to a journal, persistence in making changes, if necessary as a result of journal action. What he's saying here is that creative work is multifactorial. It's not just one task, it's multiple in combination, which means, quote, if one man exceeds another by 50% in each one of the 8 factors, his productivity will be larger by a factor of 25. On the basis of this reasoning, we see that relatively small variation of specific attributes can again produce the large variation in productivity. And so if you get better, if you get 50% better at selecting the right material at the top of the funnel, if you get 50% better at capturing the best ideas from that material, if you get 50% better at reformulating it, at writing essays, at putting together work, creating, then you won't just be marginally better. You won't be marginally more productive. You will be far more productive. You will multiply your efforts and your creativity. So, to recap, if you want to be creative and you want to think better, then you need to select better. You need to read and consume only the best. You need to capture, highlight, and reformulate only the best of the best. To do this, you want to add some friction into the process. Reformulation does this automatically, but you might also want to use some form of physical note taking, or you might have a rule where you do not copy and paste into your digital note-taking tool because it just leads to noise and bloat. And you want to orient this all towards output. You want to write and create. You want to push through the resistance and make things that are uniquely yours. And then compound it. Get better at each individual process and watch your productive and creative output evolve.